Bahrain was on the edge of the sectarian abyss, according to the country's foreign minister. With more bloodshed, more repressive police activity and further unrest in Libya, we'll be assessing how the arc of instability is spreading through the Arab world. We'll hear views from Cairo, the United States and here at home. Also tonight...
I am sorry. We got this one wrong, but we have listened to people's concerns.
This Conservative lady is for turning a rapid U-turn on the sale of forests, and it's not the first. Has Downing Street lost its grip? We speak to two political insiders about what needs to change. And loving those unlovely things on the outskirts of our cities, the writer who finds beauty in the mundane.
We can all see there's magic in sort of the ocean or in the sort of the Great British countryside, but it takes an interesting mind to look at, like, sort of say, oh, I saw this power station in Middlesex.
Good evening. At the start of the uprising in Tunisia at the beginning of last month, commentators here on Newsnight predicted that this could be the year of revolutions across the Arab world, similar to 1989 in Eastern Europe. After Egypt, today's events in Bahrain and Libya suggest that it will certainly be a year of unrest, with Arab governments in danger of being toppled and Western powers speaking the language of democracy but increasingly concerned about their own vital interests. Paul Mason takes stock.
Shortly before dawn broke in Bahrain, the police moved in to clear protesters in Pearl Square. They'd set up camp, a Bahraini equivalent of the Egyptian protest. It ended with 5 dead, dozens missing, over 100 injured.
Within minutes, we saw that the flyover bridge was full of riot police jeeps, and within seconds they had gotten out of their jeeps, come forward to the side of the bridge and started shooting at the demonstrators who had gathered in the middle of the roundabout.
Meanwhile, at the other end of the Arab world, riots broke out in Libya. And in Egypt, the post-Mubarak reality now is of daily strikes and demonstrations by workers, including these policemen, suddenly free of the fear that held them in the past. So, with unrest spreading, what are the roots of the revolt across the Middle East? And can we really say the upheavals from North Africa through to the Gulf are being driven by common factors? Well, to a great extent, what's happening in the Arab world is being driven by a mixture of economics and demographics. Across North Africa, GDP growth is decent, from 4% in Algeria, Libya at 11%, Tunisia has 4% growth, and Egypt 5.5%. But everywhere except Libya, inflation is higher still. And look now at the unemployment rates. In Algeria, 10%. In Libya, despite all the oil, 30%. Tunisia, 13%. And over in Egypt, 10% unemployment. And across the region, youth unemployment is 24%. And all these figures probably mask the real picture.
I think the political has been always an incredibly important factor, in the sense that people are very discontented politically. They feel that in a lot of ways their voices are not being listened to, and they feel like they're not represented in any of these regimes. But I think what has triggered the current demonstrations and the current massive uprisings in North Africa and Bahrain and elsewhere has been the economic. So there's this underlayer of extreme political discontent that has been set on fire in some senses by the feeling of economic desperation.
But the Gulf economically is different. Oil revenues, small populations, much stronger tribal and Islamist ideologies. In Bahrain, the ruling family is Sunni, the masses Shia. The democracy seen by many among those masses as fake. The finance minister today reduced to doling out money and a plea for calm.
Why don't we use what we have in terms of democracy, free speech, and the ability to demonstrate freely and appropriately in an appropriate way? Why resort to violence?
So the question that's vexing Western governments is, where will the unrest in the Middle East go next? How many other countries will experience these outpourings of anger about poverty and the lack of political reform? Well, Bahrain isn't the only part of the Middle East that's seen unrest in the past few days. Up in southern Iraq, focused around Basra, there's been a wave of demonstrations demanding political and economic change. And in Yemen today, thousands of protesters took to the streets demanding the ousting of the US-backed president. Meanwhile, Iran has seen its biggest demonstrations for more than a year. And all this is in the Gulf, where US Central Command has a base in Qatar. All a bit too close for comfort.
For authoritarian states that have experienced very severe economic downturns, they are at risk. And the main issue with Bahrain that makes it so interesting is if you start to see Sunni-Shia violence, that is a chasm which is very different than just fighting against an authoritarian state. The Saudis will come in.
Some see in these events a warning for the West that its strategy in the region no longer works. And that strategy was clear. Back the strongmen, sell them arms and riot gear, entertain them at global summits and tolerate a glacial pace of democratic change. The British government has in recent weeks lavished resources and attention on Bahrain. William Hague, the Foreign Secretary, there only last week. And the traditional British stance on that country outlined by a former ambassador.
Democracy is a complex concept. It's a huge mistake just to go for one man, one vote. If you do that, you get the situation you had in Iraq, where parties are formed on a purely sectarian basis. Do we want to see in Bahrain parties formed on a Shiite basis, with some Sunnis against them, many of the Sunnis of whom would be Salafis, Wahhabis? Not a pretty picture, I suggest.
But with scenes like these at Bahrain's main hospital and in the morgue, evidence too horrible to show of what a shotgun can do, Britain tonight is urgently reviewing export licences to the kingdom.
He was sleeping.
Parts of this begin to look like another Suez moment for the West, where all the assumptions have to change and the old strategies don't work. If Suez in 1956 ushered in the age of Arab strongmen, this crisis confronts the West with a volatile mix of Facebook liberals, frustrated youth and all shades of political Islam.
We do not have global leadership. We do not have global governance. And in a G0 world, tensions in the Middle East aren't getting resolved by great power politics, the United States, Europe, Russia, China, and what have you. They're getting devolved locally and regionally.
There is order of a sort in Bahrain right now, but across the region, tomorrow is being labelled a day of rage.
Paul Mason reporting there. I'm joined now from Cairo by Magdi Mohammed Ali, who is one of those taking part in the protests in Egypt. From Boston, we hope in a moment to be joined by Joseph Nye, the former chairman of the US National Intelligence Council and the inventor of the term soft power. Here by Sir Andrew Green, the former British ambassador to Syria and Saudi Arabia, and Marwa Daoudi from the Middle East Centre at Oxford University. Magdi Mohammed Ali in Cairo first. When you started to demonstrate, did you hope that the sort of things you were doing would spread to other Arab countries like Bahrain, like Libya?
Of course, all the Arab worlds are victims of dictatorships and sorts. Of course, they are not the same examples as in Egypt, not the same factors, but the main idea is the same. Most of the Arab world are suffering economically, politically, socially. And having the spark starting in Tunisia and then spreading to Egypt, which is the biggest of all the Arab countries, this is like a domino effect, in my opinion, that it will spread in most of the Arab world.
And a domino effect bringing democracy, is that what you see?
Yes, of course. That's what we hope for.
Okay. But Sir Andrew Green, democracies across the Arab world, the aspirations that we all share, there's no problem with that, is there?
Well, there's no problem in sharing the aspiration, but I think you can assume too readily that democracy is a solution for very complicated countries, particularly if you try to introduce it in a matter of days, weeks, or even months. I mean, to have a working democracy, you need all the institutions that underpin it. That takes years, maybe generations. So to imagine that, now these are very exciting times, very interesting times, we have a kind of internal combustion in the Middle East, but to think that either it will lead to democracy soon, or that is the solution to all their problems and our problems, I think is very optimistic.
Marwa Dawidi, very optimistic. And we heard in that report there, you know, you could end up with, in Bahrain, for example, simply a Sunni-Shia split, and that would be in no one's interest, was what we heard in that report.
Or you could end up with a unified national identity. That was the claim on the part of the protesters in the beginning, before it was so violently crushed by the regime. They said no Shia, no Sunni identity, we are Bahrainis. And that was very promising in the beginning. So I have to disagree with Sir Andrew. Unfortunately, I think democracy is a process. And we're not in a stage of democracy yet. We're in a process of democratization. And I think there should be trust given to the people of the region. They are able to go through the process, but they have to have a chance to do it. And the process takes time. I agree with that. There needs to be change in the institutions, but there needs also to be a chance given to the people who are asking. And I think, in fact, they are the sovereign, you know, the source of sovereignty in these areas.
Joseph Nye, joining us from Boston. I just wondered how far you take an optimistic view of the events in Egypt, Bahrain and elsewhere, and how far you worry, as some do, about instability and chaos.
Well, I'm optimistic in the direction that we're headed, but we're not at our destination yet. For example, I heard an Egyptian protester say the other day that he hoped the military wouldn't have elections too soon, because elections too soon mean that the Muslim Brotherhood and other organized groups will be able to dominate, and the new generation that was demonstrating in Tahrir Square won't have time to get themselves organized as political parties. So democracy is more than elections. It's getting the building blocks in place in the right timing.
Do you see, Professor Nye, however, a conflict between what you talked of as soft power, the kind of cultural things that America stands for and other places stand for, and that are a big hit in the Arab world, and American hard power, which is disliked by many people in many Arab countries, and which means that perhaps your American interests may be overturned?
Well, one has to realize that you need both hard and soft power in this world. In my new book, The Future of Power, I argue that this is smart power. For example, in Bahrain, the Americans do have to be concerned about the naval base. They have to be concerned about Iran. But if they're not also aligning their soft power narrative with the next generation, that stability will be illusory. It'll be temporary stability, not long-term stability. So a smart power strategy is able to combine hard and soft. I think Obama did that reasonably well in Egypt. Whether they'll be able to do it well in Bahrain, we don't yet know.
Sir Andrew, I mean, the West has obvious real interests here. Do you see that the West simply standing by and letting whatever democratic movements take their course, or do you see a degree of interference to protect those interests?
There's very little we can do in these situations. The government's concerned, and of course these countries are very different from each other. But the people in power in these countries, several of them, are now fighting for their lives, literally. And they're not going to be terribly interested in our comments. I think the risk of this discussion is we jump over the present and the immediate future to a perhaps distant and desirable goal, but we've got to get from here to there. And meanwhile, you've got to start from where you are.
But what are the dangers? You said there's a number of Arab leaders who are quite seriously looking at whether they're going to be in power tomorrow or the next day. Yes. I mean, should Britain help them, just stand by, continue to sell them arms, which is a matter of considerable controversy, for example?
Well, if you take one example like Bahrain, the government have clearly decided to put down that trouble by force and to use as much force as they need. They would not have done that without a green light from Saudi Arabia and possibly even an assurance of support if they needed it. But they've gone down that road. They have suppressed violently the Shia, as Marwa says, and you can't come back from that. That is going to lead to continued strife for years to come. What do we do? There's very little we can do about it. It's their decision.
Is that a good thing that the other countries like Britain stay out of it and just benignly try to observe? And do you really foresee that happening? I mean, there are huge interests in the Gulf and elsewhere.
Absolutely. It's a highly strategic area. I think it's in the interest of the global powers and the foreign actors to stay out of what is happening. The process can tilt either way. If you give it a chance, I think there would be a long-term stability instead of counting on repressive regimes to have stability and securing Western interests in the region. Interfering now, I mean, we had a discussion about hard and soft power. What the Middle East has seen in the recent years is mainly hard power. I mean, the Iraq war was launched in 2003, and that was